Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and be very welcome to our last day of the EFSA conference. My name is Marta Ugas. I'm the Chief Scientist at EFSA, and as Chair of the External Advisory Committee in charge of overlooking the scientific program, it's my real pleasure to award the most voted poster at the app most used person. So the votes, there was a possibility to vote for the posters via the application. The vote had to be received by the end of yesterday. And we're also very pleased that we just learned that more than 800 people were following by live stream the poster pitches by the different presenters. And today, I'm very pleased to announce the name of the most voted poster, who goes to Matthias Amundsen. Matthias is an EFSA trainee from Finland, and the title of the poster is Safety Assessment of Insects and Their Products as Food on the nutrition area. We also had the application super user. And the application super user award is given to the participant who has used the app most extensively to interact with the stage during sessions by asking questions and participating to the polls, but also to vote posters and network with other participants. So it's my real pleasure to announce that the award of the super user goes to Marta Mix. Marta is Polish, and she works in Denmark as a regulatory and scientific affairs manager at Glycom, a company focusing on human milk oligosaccharides approvals as novel food in the EU and the US. So please, Matthias and Marta, join me on the stage. To announce your colleague. Hi.
Hey. Hey. Thank you very much for the award. I have to say that I didn't write the poster by myself, so Ermolaus Ververis, could you join me up here on stage? Me and Ermolaus work together in the Novel Foods unit team here in EFSA, so I would really appreciate if you join me here.
Okay, so. The last plenipotentiary of the EFSA conference is about science, food, and society, and how this might change in the future. Speakers will present different scenarios. But we decided to start from those that will be directly affected in the future, so the consumers of the future. And we went to the Pioneer School in Parma and asked the pupils from there what are their ideas about what kind of food they will be eating in the future, and to imagine how will be the future regarding the food in 25 years. And as you will see, their answers were pretty creative. So we'll see now the video.
I like bread with jam and butter.
Mi piacciono molto le fragole.
Devo c'è sushi. E dopo le cipolle. Di gatto cioccolato.
I don't like spinach. Yucky for me.
So, non mi piace broccoli e marshmallows.
Cioè, secondo me ci saranno dei robot che prepareranno il cibo, che ti serviranno.
Seeing as there's water pollution around, like, globally,
there might be no fish at all in the future. So we might need to count fish out of the menu.
I will be eating shark. Dans le futur, je pense qu'on va manger des insectes. Insectes.
People will start eating insects.
Bugs.
Insetti,
Des insectes.
I have a friend which eats ants, but I don't think I would ever try an ant.
I think that I'd be disposed to eat cloned meat.
Par exemple, il fait trop chaud, il n'y aura pas assez d'eau pour les plantes et il n'y aura pas de fruits ou de légumes et les cultivations seront moins riches en produits, donc on aura moins à manger.
Paella.
Magari le persone saranno più portate a diventare vegane o vegetariane per gli scandali che sentono al telegiornale, sui giornali o comunque anche in giro dai parenti.
If the climate change, there could be no cows, there could be less fish and stuff like that. So we would have to make more food in the laboratory, which is harder and more expensive maybe.
Un ingrediente mágico para que yo saber leer y pueda hacer el sushi cuando quiera.
So this is what the kids, the children think about the future. But what is the view of the experts? We will now hear that in our next session, Staying Relevant in a Changing World. And it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of the session, Elke Anklam. Elke is the Director of Food and Consumers at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. And it's my pleasure to welcome Elke. Elke, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you, Marta. And ladies and gentlemen, after this really inspiring video, we will have certainly an enlightening session this morning. Staying Relevant in a Changing World, this is our title of this plenary, which will close the 2018 EFSA conference. And it is also planned that some ideas from this session may go into EFSA strategy for 2027. We will brainstorm in this session, and we will understand how science, food, society will change, maybe in the short term, but more of a longer term. We have seen the views of the very young consumers in the film. Definitely, it is very challenging to look into the future. We will have a series of 5 presentations by great speakers, and this will be followed by a panel discussion chaired by Robert Madlin afterwards. We will explore how science, food, society will change in the future. As already said, quite a challenging task, I believe, because when we look sometimes back what we have modeled in the past and then looking into reality, you know, these things should match. And it's, of course, also very important to say there are many factors which we cannot directly influence, but which may have maybe a big impact. How will these challenges, these changes, may have an impact on our future food? And we have seen some ideas there, and on food safety, of course, because that's the underlying point for this conference for EFSA. And of course, then we have to reflect how we can prepare for this. I think it's important to say the topic of staying relevant in a changing world is not only for the food science and for food and risk assessment, risk and benefit assessments, but it holds true for everything in society, especially if you look into technological developments. And, you know, we need to keep the pace. And of course, very important for policymakers to make the right decisions in order to regulate in the most efficient way. So, again, response of appropriate risk and benefit assessment that we are thinking about, and this is the topic of today. Again, I think, as we all know, everything should be scientific, evidence-based. Sometimes we should not forget that there are other things as well we have to take into consideration, and that is also the perception of the consumers and the behavior because that's very important for policymakers to take this into account. Some of more of these soft issues, because you can have the best scientifically valid risk assessment, and maybe then again consumers may not take it, citizens will go against it. So we have, I think, also to keep this in mind when we talk about the future. After our presentations, we will have a question and answer session. So we take all of your questions all together in one go. And then we will have a 30 minutes break before starting the part 2 of this session, and which will be, as I said, already moderated by Robert Madeleine. We will have 6 panelists in the panel afterwards. They will use, of course, the information, and they will use their knowledge, of course, and their expertise, but they will also use the knowledge and what we gain out of our presentations from the speakers, and they will then reflect how to prepare for the future. So I would like to invite all of you to be very active, to put your ideas forward, to contribute to a very active discussion, and let us start now. So I would like to start the session by calling our first speaker of this morning, and that's my colleague John Bell. John is Director in the European Commission's Directorate General Research and Innovation, and John is responsible for bioeconomy. So John, if you would like to come on the stage, please feel welcome. His title will be Global Drivers of and Shaping the Future of Biotechnology. So bioeconomy. John, the floor is yours, please.
Buongiorno, good morning. I think as the clip of the children beforehand confirms, food is our last and only common language. Food indeed has become a way of talking about a world of complexity and disruption. And in that, part of what I want to say this morning, the importance of food safety goes beyond the familiar discussions and difficult discussions we have in the institutions, because our food system is moving to the center of all the major disruptions and problems that we're facing. And if you like, our ability to navigate these changes, a lot of which will be dictated and discussed around the family table. Food is actually becoming a kind of vernacular, and food safety a kind of vernacular language for dealing with the very complex changes that our societies are facing. So a little bit of taxonomy. I know we have a lot of recovering natural scientists in the room. I'll try and move from the general to the particular, and to say basically 3 things and to make one invitation. The first is really to say that our food system is at the center of the age of disruption that we're starting to live through. The second is to say that in order to address this, not just, as Elke has said, food risk assessors or regulators or the public, but everybody has to start looking at the whole food system, the food and nutrition system, to convene ideas around how we can actually navigate to a new future. And this is where the Food 2030 that you see mentioned on the slide comes in, which is the European Commission's research and innovation framing of these challenges and opportunities. And the third point, and it's an obvious point to many of you in the scientific community, is that public research and innovation not only needs to step up in terms of investing in issues like food safety, but it needs to engage in a much more urgent, focused, conjoined and connected way to give the pathways to the transformations that will allow us to continue to have the world's greatest food safety system and to share its benefits with our neighbours. And this is where the Horizon Europe programme that is taking shape comes in. And my invitation at the end, and while you're here and listening or suffering through this opening session with me speaking, I would ask you to think about how would we shape a partnership between people who are not having the same conversation but who are facing the same problems. So how in the future will we bring together the risk assessment community, the member states and their scientists, the vets, the regulators, and the research and innovation community who I deal with and the coordinators and all the rest in building a new partnership. And again, for the natural scientists, a definition at the beginning. The bioeconomy basically is a way of looking at all of those biological resources that are renewable from land and sea, like crops and forests and fish, animals, microorganisms and waste, all creatures great and small, to produce food materials and energy. And it's a way that the European Union is starting to frame some of the connectedness that we need to have between different policy areas like agriculture and food safety and marine science and research to find new pathways. And in a month's time, we'll be presenting a new communication. So this is my 12 horsemen of the apocalypse slide. If you look at any of the drivers of change, we're living in an age of disruption, whether we talk about the fact that we are, the climate has changed, although most people haven't realized it. We're wasting a third of our food. It's the third largest contributor, food waste, to greenhouse gases after China and America. The extreme weather is bringing completely different assumptions to how we handle pests, animal, plant health, and diseases. We have all kinds of issues in terms of the double burden of obesity and hunger, and hunger is rising for the first time in 3 or 4 years. And that said, our food system is taking most of our water, a large part of our energy, and is not using in an efficient way resources which we are losing in terms of nutrients and proteins and raw materials. So we're facing the perfect storm in an age of disruption. And more so than this, the issue is that public trust has now become a key issue in convening people around a new destination. So what are we to do in a world where people will believe anything except evidence? And how are we to build a response when we can see that the food system is front and center to changing the system to what we call sustainability, which is not just a set of goals, it's a place where we will be living within a decade, within 10 productive seasons in agriculture, if you like. And food safety has to be at the center of that, because trust has become the currency in the new economy, and people have to be brought into a new way of considering and imagining the future. So Food 2030 was our response in the Research and Innovation Department to try and frame from a research and innovation point of view how we can actually move forward in framing solutions and mobilizing different partnerships. And we've broken it down into these 4 big areas: nutrition, climate, circularity, and increasingly communities involved in innovation. We need a systems approach across policies, and now we need to put food safety at the center of the systems approach and connect it in a way that it has the toolkit and the pathways to deal with this. So how are we going to raise the impact of research and innovation for food and nutrition security? How do we mobilize the different scientific and policy communities who are working in different orbits? How do we build new partnerships? And how do we create the toolkit for food safety in 10 years' time? If you look at the food safety system in 2030, what would success look like? And what do you and those of you who are in the process of building it need from the research and innovation system that is publicly funded to make it happen? And here you can see a number of different ways of approaching that. I see we have farm to fork to gut and back. We even have people in the microbiome area talking about from Bacter to tractor. So third point is public investment in research and innovation. We've heard about this, we've talked about this, but actually we're in a position now with Horizon Europe and the European Union's budget for the future, where in a €100 billion presentation, the food is back as an actual cluster, what's called a cluster. It has been tabled by the Commission as 10% of the Horizon Europe budget, a €10 billion budget for food and natural resources. And so there's an opportunity here uniquely to build on what we've been doing in Horizon 2020, the current European Union programme, where we've been dealing with everything from Xylella and the bee health, animal welfare, zoonosis, and the usual array of specific problems, to shift to a more systemic and strategic way of actually changing the context. We are actually designing Horizon Europe in a completely different way. So Michael Scannell and Elke and my other colleagues from all the other Commission departments are sitting together to design this cluster. So food safety is at the center, climate is integrated, circularity, waste, digitalization, all of the different colleagues are sitting around the table. And we will come out in public in a few months' time when the institutions have decided on the shape and frame of the legislation to engage in a discussion with different communities to say, okay, what kind of missions should we design? What kind of partnerships should we design to actually meet together the challenges of the future? And that's why the timing of the invitation from Bernard and Marta was extremely welcome. because I'd like you to look at this and to engage with this in your different areas in the next 6 to 9 months. Horizon Europe will allow us to have cross-cluster collaborations. We're talking with our colleagues in health about One Health, about a global microbiome initiative, about toxicology, about public trust, about maybe creating a public commons on consumer behaviour that can be used by public authorities. We're trying to hardwire innovation. We're trying to get our colleagues in Connect, where Robert Madlin did such a great job recently, to bring the power of data analytics and all of the other aspects of digitalization together. And for the first time, we're trying to build synergies with the Common Agricultural Policy, with food safety, and with other areas of policy. So it is really a unique opportunity. I won't go through this in detail. I spoke about the 12 horsemen of the apocalypse, but science really is the cavalry that's at our disposal to come and help us to find solutions. As we move through disruption, we can harness disruption. As we move into this century of biology, to try and decide how do we use research and innovation with society to address these problems and to build the kind of sustainable society we're talking about. And whether you look at some of the opportunities, and the children were ahead of their time talking about novel proteins, alternative sources of protein, food printing, probiotics, personalized nutrition, food derived from urban farming, water, data analytics, blockchain. There's a whole array of tools that are also there, and we need to start prioritizing what is it that we need to use and how do we use it and how do we engage the people whose trust we need to have in using it to develop the food safety system that's fit for the future. So Elke, my last slide. An Irishman is somebody who speaks very, very quickly in other people's sleep. So Food Safety System 2030. What would you design if you're to say, what would success look like to you, who day to day here or looking online or on stream in different places and parts of the food safety system of Europe? What do you need from research and innovation, systematically, strategically, so that in 2030 we continue to have the world's greatest food safety system here in Europe, share it with the rest of the world, and have it believed in and trusted and connected to the people who will live and work with it? There's no lack of ideas. If you look at the needs that we're facing, whether we talk about nutrition and health claim tools, assessment tools for novel foods, the cocktail effects that people need to look at, how should we manage toxicology? Should we go down the route of the United States and actually have a toxicology program? What should the solution be? How do we harness genomics and metagenomics? I mentioned the microbiome. In one of my tasks, we're about to launch a global microbiome initiative, and harnessing the European Union and the great scientific communities around the world behind this is the biggest, probably game-changing initiative since the Human Genome Project. What do we want from that, and where should we start? Should we make it start to work in the areas that have the maximum benefit for the most people around the world? Should it concentrate on benefiting the people who need it most in the food system first? How do we deal with distributed ledger technology and data analytics in a way that will allow the public to have real-time transparency and trust in our system in the future? And then the circularity that we're shifting to, where what was once waste and regulated out needs to be something which is a raw material and regulated in a radically new, sustainable and circular economy. So that is the last point I want to raise. How do we structure, in the light of Food 2030, from this huge ecosystem of opportunities and issues, a food safety approach, a new partnership or platform together where we can bring, and this is what European integration is about. There is a convening power at the heart of European integration, which is about getting together to change the context and not simply to accept our constraints as they are. So how would we do that? And if we're going to look at it, what are the future tools that we need? And where do we look at some of these issues like cocktail effects and so forth? The modern technologies, and how can they be used to support the risk assessment, the regulation, and the public trust that all go together in what is really a core part of our assumed European civilization. European food safety is an assumed part of our democratic and political DNA. So I'd like to finish on that and to say to you, if we're looking at, Shelley talked about unacknowledged legislators, the family table in the places where people still have tables and eat around it is going to be probably the decisive site in negotiating public trust around a lot of the changes that are already in place. And you can ask yourself, if we have to follow public discourse and the Twitter sphere, we won't be very confident in the future. But one of the things we did when EFSA was established, I mean, those of us like Michael Scannell and Robert Madlin and our colleagues in the JRC and elsewhere who are at the centre of facing the BSE crisis a generation ago, it was a completely unknown and chaotic future that we were facing. And what did? We convened people, we organised ourselves, we created institutions, we built the evidence, we built the governance, we worked with the member states, the European level and the public to create confidence where there had been nothing but doubt. And that on a larger scale is the challenge we're facing. So remember, food is our common language, food safety is our vernacular. There will be no security without food security. There will be no food security without food and nutrition security. And there will be none of the above without a food safety system that continues on the great traditions of this organisation. And I invite you in the coming months, our colleagues in risk assessment, regulation, research, to join us and meet to imagine what that partnership and platform can be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Please, yes, you can choose your seat. I know that the clock was running faster. I had the feeling as well, somewhere in between, suddenly it was only 5 minutes. But very enlightening, very many information we have in here, but we need to go on, so we will have this for later questions. I would like to invite our next speaker, our second speaker of this morning, Professor Tim Benton. Please come forward. He is working at the Faculty of Biological Sciences in the University of Leeds, and Tim is Dean of Strategic Research Initiatives at the University of Leeds. So his title will be The Future of Food. So here we are again into this very exciting topic, scenario analysis. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's somewhat ironic that John talks about European integration and the next speaker is a British person. I apologise for everything that's going on. So I'm going to talk about the food system from a different level. I'm not going to particularly focus on food safety, but I want to structure this talk around the issue of food, because food safety, as John said, there is no food security without food and nutrition security, and there is no food and nutrition security without food safety. It all depends on the shape of the food system and how that will deliver things in time. So I want to talk a bit about the drivers and trends, but starting off, diagram of the food system. The point I think to make about thinking from a food systems perspective is that you cannot think about agriculture alone, or you cannot think about food alone or nutrition alone without thinking about some of the complexities of the system that delivers that to the table. And all of these things are interconnected with feedback loops and all the rest of it. And my background is in theoretical ecology, working on nonlinear systems, which is why I'm interested in food systems. And the propensity for things to break and for the dynamics of the food system through feedback loops to change radically is underappreciated. So for me, that's one of the things about food systems to think about. And of course, the focus of our food system thinking should be on nutrition, health and well-being, of which food safety, of course, is an important part. But the nutrition, health and well-being of people is not just affected by the food, but it's also affected by the environment, which is affected by the production and transport and processing of food. So it comes as a whole bundle, how people interact with food. It's not just about the narrow issues of what it does to their body. So John started talking about some of the drivers for change, and I just want to highlight a couple that John mentioned. Well, the first one that John mentioned, Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. So if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, and if you remember 190-odd countries signed up to deliver these are global goals about the development of societies around the world. And food and agriculture underpins practically all of the goals. And one of the issues that the Sustainable Development Goals force us to think about is the relationships between food and other aspects of society and other aspects of life. So if we produce too much food and it impacts upon water systems, or climate systems, or air quality, or nutrition and health, or access to resources, gender, or drives antimicrobial resistance, or ... all of these things become negative. So the fact that the world has signed up to dealing with the Sustainable Development Goals implies that we have to optimize our food system to deliver right across these. And the Paris climate goals, for those of us who work in climate, it's becoming quite a scary thing to be part of because of the rate at which change is happening in our climate system. And we only have to look at this summer and some of the issues around drought and rainfall and storms to see what might be happening in the future. But the Paris Climate Agreement has two big implications for our food system, one of which is widely known and the other is slightly underappreciated. The first one is that if we are going to move into a low-carbon system and deal with climate change, instead of carrying on business as usual and living in a planet by the end of the century that might only support 7 or 8 billion instead of the 10 billion that will be on the planet, if we are going to move in the direction of dealing with climate, we have to think about changing our diets. Because, as this graph shows, if you look at the mitigation potential, so the ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, mitigation potential goes along the x-axis, from agriculture, you get that red line. If you look at the mitigation potential from changing diets, and there's a whole range of different studies driving different diets with different quantities of livestock produce in them and different amounts of vegetables in them, you have a much greater chance of dealing with climate change. And because climate change is being driven primarily by agriculture and food these days as the major polluting sector, changing diets has got to come onto the agenda. The second reason why the Paris Climate Agreement is important for our food system is that as we are overshooting greenhouse gas emissions, we will need to suck carbon dioxide back from the atmosphere in the second half of the century. And the slower we are to change our greenhouse gas emissions, the more land we will need to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The details of this graph don't matter, but under the worst scenario, which is looking pretty hopeful from where we're standing today, under the worst scenario, we would need land for biomass energy, carbon capture and storage, BECCS it's so-called. We will need land something like 2/3 the size of India, just to plant trees on to store the carbon. That is going to create an enormous pressure on agricultural land, and in turn, that is going to drive a need to reduce waste and perhaps to change diets as well. So signing up to the Paris Climate Agreement implies quite radical change in our food system, whatever he says. So however you look at our global food system, it looks quite unsustainable, and I mean unsustainable in the sense of it cannot continue unsustainable. So if you take climate change, it's driving a decline in yields throughout most of the world. That driving the decline in yields is driving up agricultural intensification, which is creating climate change. But at the same time, it's driving agricultural extensification, which is growing, having a bigger land footprint around the world, which is causing biodiversity loss, and that is driving down yields. And because we're driving climate change, it requires more land for biomass energy, carbon capture and storage, which requires agricultural expansion, which makes things worse. Because yields, agricultural intensification is being pushed with depleting soils, that's causing yields to decline, which makes things worse again. Because we're intensifying agriculture, we're creating cheaper and cheaper and cheaper food that is economically rational to waste, which, as John mentioned, creates climate change because there's a lot of embedded CO2, which makes things worse. Because we're driving agricultural intensification, we are selecting for fewer and fewer crops grown in larger and larger scales. That creates landscapes which are homogeneous, which drives biodiversity loss. It also allows us to feed more feed to livestock, which drives climate change. It drives malnutrition in all its forms because we're all eating exactly the same thing and it's not very nutritious. And because climate change is driving reduced nutrient content and protein content, etc., it is driving malnutrition in all its forms. So we're living in the center of a vicious circle to do with the interaction between climate and agriculture, and this will impact on food if we don't stop it. So, gosh, I'm rabbiting on fast, aren't I? I'm going to talk a bit about scenarios. So I just want to talk about scenarios as a means of strategizing for an uncertain future. Now, a scenario is a set of plausible assumptions about the way the world might work in the future. It differs from a projection, which is running something through a linear regression and drawing a line on a graph going upwards into the future, or having a complex model that does the same sort of thing. A projection is what would something like food demand be in 2050 if we keep all of these assumptions. And a projection is not a prediction. A projection is just what if. So if you have a speedometer on your car that says 45 kilometers an hour, that is not a prediction that in an hour's time you'll be 45 kilometers away. It is just saying if you continue to drive exactly this way for the next hour, you will be 45 kilometers away. Projection and prediction are two very different things. So one of the things that creates lock-in to our food system and the way we think about it is that projections are often taken as fact. So if you take the figures that John put on his graph, that demand is going to increase by 60%, that comes from having a projection of population growth, coupling that with a projection for economic growth, both of those are looking ahead, coupled with some patterns like on the graph on the right here, which is historical patterns of how economic growth converts into calorie demand. Now that is a very strong assumption to say, because that has happened in the past, that same pattern as you get richer, you eat more, will happen in the future. It's very strong, especially as we know some of the healthcare associated statistics associated with the sorts of very high caloric demand that we have made. So just because the FAO says 60% more food is required does not mean that is a fact that 60% more food is required. If we change our diets to become healthier, we will need less than 60% more food. So part of the issue about thinking through scenarios is to test the sets of assumptions and try and understand what is likely and what is plausible. So this is a graph that I love. This is projections over time, they called them forecasts, of the amount of water that will be required in the UK. And each of those projections are made at a different point in time and projected forward. And what you can see is none of those projections remotely look anything like what has happened. So, as is so eloquently put in the Silence of the Lambs, if you assume you have the potential to make an ass out of you and me, because your assumptions are almost certainly going to be wrong. So please, when you look at the literature and when you think about the future, it is not going to be a simple projection of trends as we see them now. And this is for this reason. If you look back just over the last decade or so and think about what has happened and think about what is possible to happen over the next decade, it becomes quite an scary, changeable experience, uncertain. So, 5 years ago, Brexit was on the horizon. Trump was not even possible to imagine. What happens if Trump and North Korea fall out? What happens if there's a really strong trade war with China? What happens if there's another global economic crisis? There is discussion last week by people high up in finance around the world saying how fragile the financial system still is. What happens if inequality continues to grow and radicalism still continues to grow and terrorism becomes more defining of the way we move around the world and migration becomes a greater pressure because of climate change and because of storms and because of droughts and so on? What happens if there's a new Sino-Russian pact and a new axis that creates tensions, geopolitical tensions in the world? What happens to Ukraine? And how might those sorts of interruptions change our globalized food system? All of these are very real and very potential issues that can disrupt things. And when you start really investigating the fragility of our global systems, they are quite frightening. I was telling a couple of people in the pub last night, I went to a meeting in Singapore about 18 months ago, and there was a central banker there, and he said he was so worried about the stability of financial systems that he kept 20% of his wealth in gold coins. The reason being that he was pretty certain that sometime over the next 20 years, he would wake up one day and he wouldn't be able to get any money out of banks because there'd be a cyber attack or something and everything would fall apart. And then what do you do for food? You can't sell your house for a loaf of bread. You need small, tangible bits of value that you can barter. And if this is a central banker saying these sorts of things, and climate change specialists say these sorts of things, water specialists say these sorts of things, the fragility of our cyber specialists say these sorts of things, the fragility of our global systems is often assumed to be strong, whereas in fact is weak. So when you look at the potential future impactors on our world, this is a graph. I don't think you can see the details, but you can kind of see the shape. Around the outside are some of the major megatrends, such as cyber dependency, aging population, and so on and so on. All of these megatrends interact with each other to create social risks. And right in the middle, that big red dot, or relatively big red dot, is profound social instability. This is an annual publication from the World Economic Forum, and it says that there are so many interacting things that it is almost likely in any given year that something will disrupt the way the world works. And from a statistical perspective, we often talk about black swans being the low probability, high impact events. When you have the potential for so many black swans in so many different guises to appear, it is almost certain one of them will appear over a given time period. So the world is becoming more disruptable because of the interaction between all of these trends and global events. And we talk about a tuna world. We're now living in a tuna world, turbulent, uncertain, novel, ambiguous. The international rule-based cooperation of the past 20 or 30 years looks incredibly fragile. And then what would that mean for our food system? So there are many emerging drivers of systemic change. As I said, the move away from international rules-based cooperation. Was the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement the last hurrah of the UN post-war Bretton Woods institutions? Inequality as a driver of social change, both within and between countries. Climate change and environmental degradation have a real risk of driving social instability and increasing shocks. Global fragility, as I said. And healthcare costs around the world being driven by poor diets. We need to move towards preventative models of healthcare and away from curative models of healthcare. Otherwise, our societies will become bankrupt. And of course, moving towards preventative models of healthcare requires us to change our interrelationship with food. So if there's one thing to take away from this talk, it is to go away from here and open your mind to the potential for a radically, radically different world over the coming decades, and not just more of the same gradually evolving. So in my last 3 minutes, 52 seconds, I just want to talk a little bit about some scenarios. Now, lots of scenario analyses have been done in lots of different domains, but I'm just going to highlight a set of scenario analysis exemplified by the World Economic Forum's one, which has two axes of plausibility. One is that people move towards sustainable and healthy diets because of the healthcare costs and because of the sustainability costs. And one is that instead of moving ever more towards globalized food systems, we move away towards more local or regionalized markets. So the drive for globalization, we all know, we've lived with it for the last 30 or 40 years. And that happens where you have a stable world, where there's international rules-based cooperation, where we all enjoy working together and cooperating, and economic growth comes from maximizing comparative advantage and so on. And you have very strong growth of international corporations which hold a lot of political power. All of that works in a stable world, at least to some extent. But post-Trump, post-Brexit, it highlights the risks of growing protectionism, growing nationalism, inward-looking instead of outward-looking, the breakup of international rules-based cooperation, war terrorism, disrupting things, climate change impacts disrupting things, people wanting stuff that is grown locally for whatever reason, because it's more transparent, because they like it, because they think it's more sustainable, because it's what they're familiar with and it's not this foreign rubbish, whatever. there is a real potential of moving in that direction. And likewise, you can think of many drivers towards changing the sustainability and healthiness of our food system coming from climate change action, carbon tax, more polluter pays principle, internalizing externalities, and so on. And you can think of many reasons from a health perspective to drive food into a more healthy direction, whether it is planning law about where you put your fast food outlets, whether it is health insurance that you get a rebate if you have a healthy lifestyle, whether it is a food tax based on unhealthiness, as we're trying in the UK, whether it is public health education, whatever it might be, as our health systems start to creak and collapse, we will be in a situation where we move in that direction. And what I want to emphasize in my last 2 slides is that our globalized food system has incentivized us throwing all of our costs onto the environment and onto health systems because we can make a profit within our food system. But as the data becomes more and more available and more transparent, people will react against this. Part of the issue to do with air quality in cities is driven by intensive agriculture outside of cities. And as air quality goes up the political agenda, agriculture will come on the agenda. And when you do focus group work with people, they often say, we trust the food system and we trust its governance to make things right for us. We don't want to know about the details, but we trust. And when that trust breaks down, then there is danger. So cheap food is not a public good, which is often what we assume, if it makes things worse, and there is the data to show that it is. Sorry, I'll just skip over all of these. So you can put text in the boxes around all of these different food scenarios, and I would refer you just to find the WEF report, put text in the box. But I just want to concentrate on the last 2 in my last 15 seconds or so, and these are the open source sustainability, which is what happens in a globalized world when everybody eats healthily and sustainably, versus the more regionalized food systems when people eat healthily and sustainably. If we live in a globalized world, it would be pretty much our business as usual scenario. Large-scale agriculture shifting around the world, biofortification, lots of stuff based on commodity crops, long supply chains, robotics, AI, all of those sorts of things that we so fondly imagine is the future. But if we move towards a regionalized food system, what does that mean? That means that we have to grow more, we have to be more diverse, we have to be more small scale, we won't have comparative advantage, so we have to really concentrate on waste. We have to think about agriculture to provide healthy diets and get that whole nutrition-sensitive agriculture on the table. We need a completely different innovation environment based on smaller scale mixed farming systems and not just large scale robotics and AI. And if there's a second message to take away, is that the plausibility of different futures means that we should not lock ourselves into one research agenda based on one set of technologies. So, conclusions. The world is changing. Some of these changes are difficult because we're locked in. Readjustments are really possible given the way the world is changing. Alternative futures are imaginable. Such futures do imply a revolution, and it would be a revolution that would require quite big changes, including in social support, because food prices will be regressive. And that revolution could come from internally, from us, driving new systems, wanting better diets, or it could be forced upon us by climate change or geopolitics, and so on. So there is a business unusual future that looks better. I've shown this slide at a previous meeting, so I'll leave that there. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Tim. Please choose your seat. Thanks a lot for your interesting and quite alarming messages we have got from here. I think we have a lot of food for thought for our panel discussion later on as well on this respect. We have to move on. I would like to call my dear colleague Sandra Caldera. Sandra is working in the directorate I'm responsible for, Health, Consumers and Reference Materials of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Sandra is Deputy Head of Unit, and her title is about consumers, consumer archetypes in future food systems. Sandra, the floor is
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, EFSA, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you, speaking about future consumers. And I need to start by saying that I am not a consumer researcher and I am not a crystal ball reader, but I have done several studies together with my colleagues at the Joint Research Center, looking into the future and looking into the future of foods, the futures of diets, and our health. And it's the insights that I gained from the possible future consumers that I want to share with you today. So I start with a conceptual map where we try to represent all the factors that influence consumer choice and food consumption, and eventually consumer health. And I don't want to take you through it. I just want you to see how many factors actually are there and the impact that they may have on food consumption. And at the same time, I want you to think that the consumer at the center of this conceptual map can actually influence all these factors outside it as well. And I think this is very important. This is also the message that Tim was trying to portray, is that everyone has a role to play here. Before we get to the future consumers, I tried to have a portrait of an average EU consumer. We looked at several surveys, Eurobarometers, and so on, and this is what I think we can summarize. The average EU consumer understands the general concepts of a healthy diet, feels confident and well-informed about food, purchases taking into account mostly quality, price, but is also, of course, sensitive to appearance, taste, pleasure, all these things that we're used to. Nowadays buys in supermarkets, and there's a trend towards spending less time cooking at home and more time in out-of-home eating. I made sure that I would bring you also some colorful pictures of different meals in different countries of the EU 28, because I wanted to highlight that we are, of course, all individual consumers, and in our countries we are also individual consumers, and each country, of course, has its own particularities, traditions, cultures, etc. So while we can speak of an average consumer, we need to bear in mind all this diversity. I was asked to speak to you about the future consumers, though, so how shall that look like? Well, if you look at this population pyramid for 2060, one thing is obvious: the average EU consumer will be much older than what it is now. Other things, though, and other insights are perhaps more difficult to predict, and also Tim spoke a little bit about it. So I'll tell you some things that we learned from the two foresight studies that we did, with two different aims. Actually, one was looking at research priorities for foods and health for 2050, and the other one, a little bit more recent, and that's mostly the one where I'm basing this talk in, looked at the resilience of our legal framework. So we looked at the future, and I'm not going to go into detail with foresight methodologies with you. I just want you to understand, and I think Tim made a point in that as well. It's not only about our imagination. There's a structured thinking into all of these. We identify drivers of the particular system that we are looking at, so which are the factors that can actually impact change on this system or in the food system. For each of these drivers, we will look at the directions that they may take, and we will then think of plausible combinations of all these drivers. And we end with, possible futures and very thorough descriptions of these futures. Here are the four that we looked at in the study. I'm just going to focus on three next. I need to say that we don't only describe the world as we imagine it in 2050, we also think of how we'll progress from now to this 2050 world. So if I take one of our scenarios as an example, pharma food, I think it's pretty obvious what we're going to eat in this scenario in 2050. I'll just take you through how we envisaged that we got to this world. So we start with today, and we start with the real public health issues that we have: high incidence, prevalence of non-communicable diseases, and high pressure in our financial systems from public health expenditure due to these diseases. We're slowly recovering from a financial crisis, and population is aging. There's Food 2030 maybe from John Bell, and the real realization that investment in prevention of non-communicable diseases can have an impact and somehow modulate a healthier future in front of us. So actually, in the extension of healthy life years, both governments and individuals agree. So there's a win-win in here. Citizens become also much more health aware, probably because they see with an aging population the limitations that these non-communicable diseases can have on them. So eventually, at some point between now and 2050, science has brought to us evidence-based, targeted diets, personalized nutrition. Europe is actually quite a strong player in this arena. I mean, we have very strong food industry traditions. We also have strong pharma industry that has the resources to invest in this type of foods that we will call in our future foods with PH. We envisage that these foods are not only foods with health claims, but they can also be medicalized foods. So this is our consumer in the pharma food 2050 world. You can see he's aged but healthy and happy. Has access to many different types of foods as we know it today, fortified, for example, but also foods in the form of powders that you can mix and match according to your needs, liquids, meal replacements, etc. This consumer is really very much driven by health, has access to a lot of data about his or her own health, and this is what makes him drive these choices. There's obvious challenges in this world, and this is what we explore in our study. So we stretch a little bit the futures so we can identify the challenges, and then we can propose policy solutions, options, research priorities, etc. for this. So in this drive for health, one of the challenges identified is that actually the line between health and human enhancement can become crossed sometimes, or can be crossed sometimes. And this has clear problems, for example, regarding to inequality. The fact that we have all this data about ourselves brings up data protection issues. The fact that we are adding therapeutic compounds to our foods may mean that, for example, fraud can have very serious consequences. So there's a series of challenges that one can consider in this personalized nutrition and foods world that need to be looked at. The fact that consumers will actually mix and match and produce their own food makes these consumers prosumers as well. And the impact that this can have, and the fact that actually these mixtures can have serious side effects, has led some of our participants to propose that, for example, there could be a food license. The same way that we have a driver's license, this could be a license that would allow people to produce this kind of foods for themselves and perhaps for those that they care for. Clearly, this world needs to be fast. I mean, innovation will be fast, and acceptance of this innovation needs to be fast as well. So maybe we need to enhance post-market monitoring and controls rather than the pre-market that we have nowadays. And clearly for EFSA, there will be some challenges as well. And I think John mentioned already, cocktail mixtures, cumulative effects, long-term exposures, all these need to be clearly assessed. I'll take you through another world. This is global food. I'm not going to detail how we got there because I think Tim did a pretty good job in explaining how plausible this scenario is as well. This is the consumer in the global food world. So the global food world is really highly globalized. The way we envisaged is Europe is a player in this food system, but is not the only player or strongest player by far. All the BRIC countries have a very strong role to play in here as well, and so the US and other countries. So we're sourcing food ingredients from all over the place, but we do have climate change and resource depletion that is pressing. So technology is pretty much geared towards efficiency, and there's a clear drive for mass production. So paradoxically, although we're sourcing ingredients from all over the world, the consumer doesn't have access to much diverse food. There's a lot of highly processed food, mostly because there's also not much access to fresh produce in this world. This world comes with its challenges as well, many, and if you read the report, you'll get there. I'll just focus here on the challenges that are related to the consumer itself and to the sedentary behavior and the lifestyle that this consumer has. I mean, clearly, because Europe is not a strong economy in this country, people struggle. They work long hours. They have perhaps 2 jobs, so there's not much time to consider physical activity and other issues. So there's an environment that actually pushes towards unhealthy behaviors, and that's what we try to address with the policy options that we suggested in our report and that you see here. So they're mostly related to fiscal measures, reformulation, public procurement with healthier standards, etc. There was interesting discussions in here as well about harmonized labeling internationally, so beyond languages using symbols for labels. And finally, and I will also not take you through how we got to the regional food scenario because Tim again covered this, it is a plausible world. I'll just describe what happens in a 2050 world that looks inward, where Europe is closed in a way with trade disruptions, very much focused on the circular economy. So in here again, the consumer is a prosumer. Food is very expensive. There's a high value for fresh produce, so people grow their own foods, and you can see we have an urban landscape, but it's really maximized with vertical farming, rooftop gardens, etc. You'll see also that there's a lot of technology, again, geared towards efficiency and resource efficiency. So there's an aquaponics system, a lot of remote sensing, a lot of technology also geared towards recycling of waste, reuse. And in this world as well, we will have a series of challenges that come from this. So for example, if we imagine that individuals are growing their own food, and to an extent that this actually becomes a significant proportion of the market, then the general food law might need to be readapted to actually consider the individuals that are engaging in food production. And we're not speaking only about individuals growing, strawberries in their balconies or fruits and vegetables, but actually livestock as well. So there are a series of food safety issues that may need to be looked at. The fact that we're producing food in a quite limited space may mean that sometimes there are temporary shortages of fresh produce. Sometimes there will be food poverty in this type of world. So there's a series of measures that can be put in place to cater for this as well. And of course, people produce their own food, but they will probably have informal networks where they share. So I have my chickens, and maybe if you have your aubergines or whatever, maybe we can just trade. And there will be the need also here to share the information about the food and the food safety issues. And again, from all the circular economy kind of thinking, legislation towards the safety of reusing food waste and organic side stream products in the food chain. So there's a lot of food for thinking here, actually. This is my concluding slide. The future consumer will clearly bring about new challenges, and I put future between quotation marks because I actually think that this future consumer already exists today. I think that at the moment, these future consumers that I described are perhaps a niche consumer, and the challenge will be at the point where this niche consumer becomes a sufficient size of the market for us to take him or her in consideration. There are ways, though, to identify where we're going and how big of a market does this consumer take. So one way is looking into anticipation and looking, for example, at research priorities and policy options that we need to cater for these challenges and needs that come ahead, and clearly developing indicators that will tell us where we're going in between 2018 now and this 2050 that we're considering. I mean, all the other speakers spoke about food systems as well. I don't think that I can leave the stage without reinforcing the message. It's a clear need that these studies have taught us is the need to look at these in a very comprehensive, holistic, and inclusive manner. There's many win-wins to be taken when we do this. There's some trade-offs as well, and maybe that's also a hope for the future consumer, is that the future consumer has the opportunity and really has the wish to be involved in, discussing these trade-offs and pushing the win-wins. And I will end it there with my contacts in case you want to contact me. Thank you.
Sandra, please take a seat. The consumer of the future, I'm not so sure whether we should have a food license. I can't imagine how this will work, so I get a bit scared listening to this. I see already many questions coming in on my iPad here, so I would encourage everybody to go on and stay with us and put them forward. I would like to invite now our next speaker of this morning. It's Professor John Mathers. He is from the Newcastle University. He is Professor of Human Nutrition and Director of the Human Nutrition Research Center in the Institute of Cellular Medicine, and he will bring us to the topic of personalized medicine. So we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you this morning to talk about what I see as the future of research in personalized nutrition. And in this talk, what I'm going to cover are some of the developments already in this area, particularly in the commercial world, some of the science underpinning these developments, and where I think there are considerable challenges. So personalized nutrition is already becoming big business. And in the next series of slides, I'm giving you a few examples of companies that are providing these kinds of services in different parts of the world. So this is an American company called Habit, who tell us that they will take the guesswork out of eating right for life. Let's end the pseudoscience. So they're claiming that this really is based on good evidence. And what they ask the consumer to do is to test their metabolism. You consume one of their products, you send back some biological samples, and on the basis of the measurements they make, they then advise you on how you should change your eating patterns. That's an American company. Now we're a company in Israel, again focusing on metabolic health, and particularly on control of blood glucose, which is very important in regulation of the risk of type 2 diabetes. And what this company does is to offer what they call an algorithm diet, which will help you to control your blood sugar concentrations. And again, this is high tech, and they will, if you buy into their product, offer you a personalized nutrition app. And the science underpinning the offering from that Israeli company uses information on the gut microbiome and claims to understand how each of us individually handle our food by understanding how our individual gut microbiomes process those materials. And there are companies that focus particularly on the gut microbiome. So this is again, an American company, Ubiome, who offer a warm welcome to you and to your 39 trillion bacteria. So very much about how you can understand what's going on among the bacteria in your gut using simple sample collection procedures, which you can do at home, send those off, and they return information which they claim you can then use. Another, this time, company in Australia, telling us that your gut microbiome holds insights into your health and well-being. One of their particular claims is that they give you a wider and deeper knowledge of your microbiome, the whole gut microbiome, and on the basis of that, they offer personalized dietary suggestions. So again, linking information on our resident bacteria with how we should be eating. Some companies are becoming increasingly sophisticated and looking much beyond the individual, looking at details of the foods that are available and much wider range of attributes of the individual to produce a kind of systems approach. So this is the digital signature of how food affects the body offered by the company Neutrino. And they claim that by using these kinds of approaches, you can get better management of chronic diseases and better and improved well-being, including weight management. Some companies are working with other parts of the food industry rather than directly with consumers. So this is a UK-based company, Spoon Guru, who are offering their corporate clients the opportunity to deliver a truly personal experience to their customers. And they hope that through this process, they will transform the world of food globally. And they're particularly focused here on the choices that people are making. And they claim that 64% of the world already make exclusions to their diet. And so it's helping people to make those choices that they see as their particular niche. And the big companies are also beginning to occupy this space. A couple of years ago, Samsung and Nestle began to collaborate on digital nutrition and health. And more recently, Nestle has been joining with companies in Japan to focus much more on health using artificial intelligence and genomic testing to produce personalized diets. So that's the background. Industry is already moving in this direction. So what I want to do in the remainder of the talk is to think a little bit more deeply about what personalized nutrition is and to look at what the research evidence is that it works. So we propose this definition for personalized nutrition, that it's an approach that uses information on individual characteristics to develop targeted nutrition advice, products, or services. In an era of personalized medicine or precision medicine, of course, the focus is very much on the human genome and how we can use genetic information. And a personalized nutrition approach moves away from a one-size-fits-all approach where we try to force the individual to use a common approach, for example, eating 5 portions of fruit and veg a day or 2 portions of fish a week, to an approach where the individual is in the center and we try to develop interventions or advice support for the individual. And of course, this is very important because we all behave very differently. And this waterfall plot is from a very recent weight loss study carried out in the United States with 609 individuals who underwent a weight loss intervention. And the individual lines on the plot represent the amount of weight change by those individuals. And although they were all on the same interventions intended to achieve weight loss, actually there was a huge difference in what happened. Some people actually gained weight as much as 10 kilograms over the year, whereas other people lost as much as 30 kilograms. So enormous inter-individual variation. So is there ways in which we can understand that inter-individual variation to tailor interventions, advice, support, services which are relevant for the individual? So the rationale for personalizing approaches to nutrition are that those personalized approaches may be more effective because they are more relevant. There's a strong biological basis for them working, but also because the approaches may feel more relevant and therefore improve the motivation of the individual to adopt those approaches. So we set out to test that hypothesis that personalized nutrition might be more effective than the generic one-size-fits-all approach. And this is the EU-funded Food for Me study, which I'll introduce to you now. So in this study, we recruited just over 1,600 individuals across 7 European countries. And we ran the trial very much like a clinical randomized controlled trial. Individuals were recruited via the web, and we interacted with them using digital technologies. The individuals were randomized to one of 4 treatments. So the control group were individuals who were randomized to generic dietary advice. That was level 0. And then those in levels 1, 2, and 3 were randomized to personalized dietary approaches on different bases. So for level 1, we personalized the advice based upon an analysis of their current eating patterns. In level 2, we added to that by an analysis of phenotype. And in level 3, we included genotype as well as phenotype and dietary analysis. So to try and understand how sophisticated you need to be to achieve an improvement in the efficacy of a personalized approach. So this generated a lot of complex information on diet, on phenotype and genotype, and we developed algorithms to use that information to deliver individual advice to each of the people who took part in the study. I'm showing you now just the take-home message from the main part of the study. And we looked at the healthiness of the diet by calculating the so-called healthy eating index. And in the red box, you can see a comparison of the control group, level 0, with the people who were randomized to personalized nutrition advice. And overall, there was a significant improvement in the healthiness of the diet after 6 months in those people who had been randomized to a personalized approach. However, if you look to the right of the screen and look at the individual types of personalization, the 3 gray boxes, and the last one, the L3, is the one that included genotype, then there was no advantage of using more sophisticated approaches. So personalization worked, but it wasn't necessary, it seemed, to become too sophisticated. So take-home message from Food for Me was that personalized nutrition works. It produced bigger improvements in the healthiness of the diet than a generic approach. In this study, we saw no added advantage of using complex phenotypic or genetic information. And we showed that you could do this at a large scale by delivering the intervention across the internet. And of course, that offers great opportunities for improving public health at scale. So back now to this issue of inter-individual variation. Is it possible that the big changes in weight loss that we see in a trial such as this are something to do with the genetics of the individual? We know that individual genotype leads to differences in weight gain. So some genetic variants make it easier for us to gain weight. So could those same variants make it more difficult to lose weight? So we tested this hypothesis by looking at the FTO genotype. And FTO is the gene which has the biggest single effect on weight gain in the general population. And we did this by combining data from 8 large randomized controlled trials in which we had information on FTO genotype. And what we saw was very clear. Across these 8 large studies, almost 10,000 individuals, there was no effect of FTO genotype on changes in body mass index in response to weight loss intervention. And this was robust when we adjusted for all the sorts of things which might influence the outcome. And we had similar findings when we looked at body mass or waist circumference as alternative outcomes. So the take-home message was that FTO genotype might contribute to increased body weight, might make it easier for us to become fatter, but it's not an impediment to losing weight. And this was the same whether the weight loss was induced by diet and exercise, or how long the study ran, or the characteristics of the individual. So personalized nutrition is all about changing behaviors. And that's the critical bit. And changing behavior is pretty difficult. We might know what to do, but putting it into practice is not always easy. And there's a big research gap here in understanding the genetics of behavior change. We don't know enough about the genetic basis of things like attention, memory, reward, motivation, all the kind of areas which are encompassed by behavioral genetics. And this is an area where future research might help us to understand how we could tailor information using genetics to improve personal choices. So I think in the future, personalized nutrition will adopt more systems approaches, where we'll have more sophisticated information about participant characteristics. We'll understand better the psychological and social barriers and facilitators to changing what we eat. We'll understand more how to work with people's aspirations. And all of that can be combined to deliver personalized nutrition advice and support. And importantly, it can link with self-monitoring so that we get feedback on how well we're progressing along a desired pathway, and eventually lead to greater health and well-being. And there's already research on this element of self-monitoring, which suggests the ways in which this might go. So these are images from the Pioneer 100 Wellness Project, carried out in the USA, in which individuals chose to join a research project, provide biological samples, and make very detailed recordings of many aspects of behavior. Another example where they combined not only clinical and behavioral measurements, but information on what the individual was doing. For example, the number of flights that they took, and for an audience like that, that might be very relevant. And then medical information on, for example, on insulin sensitivity and on inflammation. Collecting about 250,000 measurements per day on up to 43 people for 2 years. So generating huge amounts of large, complex data. So we're now into the big data world. And alongside that, we have developments in technology. This is an example of a spray-on nanomesh wearable developed by a group in Tokyo, which offers opportunities for continuous monitoring of a whole range of metabolites in body fluids, which could be used for biomarkers of how well we're responding to changes in diet. And I think the future of this area is already very clear, that we're linking these developments in technologies, wearable and other technologies, with big data, with artificial intelligence approaches, which all feed back to simple-to-use technologies delivered through mobile phones. And that seems to be the direction of travel for small and large companies. But I think that those developments bring with them a number of significant challenges. And in my last slide, I want to focus on what these challenges are. It's clear that the potential market for personalized nutrition is huge, and companies big and small are already beginning to occupy this space. One of the problems, I think, is that personalized nutrition is in the marketplace before we have good evidence of what actually works, and equally important, what doesn't work. This whole business area has developed without regulatory oversight, without any defined standards, and without any obvious consumer protection. Most of the commercial offerings that are out there use proprietary algorithms that are not subject to independent verification. So it's very difficult to know how robust the information is that they offer to their users. And then thinking more at a more societal level, we need to ask the question, will these personalized nutrition approaches exacerbate or ameliorate health inequalities and disparities? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Bringing us into a very complex area, and I like your questions in the end, and I see also many questions coming in this respect, but also one more maybe to add is this affordable, the whole approach, and to everybody globally. So then maybe coming to the last presentation of our session, I would like to invite Professor Catherine McComas. She is from the Cornell University. She is a professor of the Department of Communication there, and her talk will be about the communication challenges we have, because we come up with so many messages to the consumers, to the educated consumers, normal consumers. So how can we look into this communication of the future? Please.
Oops. There we go. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts on future communication challenges related to food safety. Who am I? I'm a social scientist. I'm an avid people watcher, professor of communication at Cornell, where my research, teaching, and public engagement examine how can we better understand how people respond to health and environmental and scientific risks. Some might say, how do we understand individuals' rationales for their seemingly irrational behavior in the face of what many might consider irrefutable scientific evidence? As a communications scientist, my inquiry focuses on the methods of delivery, as well as the content. I also study how the characteristics of the source and the characteristics of the recipients influence response to communication. The topic of this morning's plenary, staying relevant in a changing world, captures the imagination and our aspirations of where we hope to go to better ensure global food safety and food security. And communication will be an intrinsic part of the success or the failure of these efforts. To help guide these efforts toward success, I offer 3 observations, 3 fundamental principles. None of these may be considered rocket science, so to speak. However, just as every mission to put a man on the moon, or a woman on the moon, to send someone into outer space must understand the fundamentals of aerodynamics, so every effort to better communicate with audiences about food safety must require an understanding of the fundamentals of communication science. So, observation 1. You cannot control the field of messages to which your audience is exposed. You can only control your own message. And you better get it right. Let me show an example, just taking one. A lean, finely textured beef, also known as pink slime. This product was used as a beef filler for decades. It was actually used to try to improve the safety of the beef product. But attention was garnered when a USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture inspector, nicknamed it pink slime. And in 2009, the New York Times picked it up as a story, and it soon captured the attention. The lower graph shows when the searching for the term pink slime sort of grew out, and it really touches around this 2009. 2011, Jamie Oliver picked it up. In 2012, there was an uproar to remove it from school lunches and fast food chains, etc. If we think about what we learned from this, and this was a piece that was put out by the Secretary for Food Safety at the USDA, setting the record straight on beef, who felt like it was imperative to put out that it is important to distinguish people's concerns about how their food is made from their concerns about food safety. Now, herein lies a challenge, because one would say, how can you divide concerns about how something is made from concerns related to food safety? The New York Times also picked this up, and Mark Bittman wrote an article that talked about pink slime in the larger context, and arguing, whether or not it's fair, public outrage has thrown it off a cliff. And he went on to write, yet the outcry is justified. The response by some food safety officials that it's misguided and only experts should be determining how food is processed is shameful, in his words. What I'd like to point out is this interesting quote saying that before the internet, companies and governments simply made decisions assuming the public didn't know or even care, but this is no longer the case. And so in the context of thinking about future communication challenges, we're often said, well, today's internet environment, the ubiquity of information means that we will never be able to control that information. I would caution, though, to say that this was happening before the internet. I don't know if those of you around the room remember the ALAR scare of 1989, which was the concern about pesticide residues on apples in the US, and perhaps it happened in Europe as well. But in the US, and due to a 60 Minutes television show broadcast, it had pictures of mothers running after school buses to pull the apples out of their children's lunch boxes. That was 1989, now granted, not really pre-internet, but pre this time of pink slime, if you will. We have multiple sources and challenges, and we really channels, and we really cannot contain them. And just thinking about the issue of glyphosate and how you only have to Google it to find many, many different information sources saying it's safe, it's not safe, and how is the consumer supposed to understand this? Of course, this has had a recent resurgence in news cycle in the US due to the finding of an individual who had cancer that was linked by the courts to exposure to this pesticide. And again, it then had another wave of attention around the risks associated with this. We cannot control the message. So reconciliation. People are not passive audiences waiting to be enlightened by your messages. Throughout this meeting, I've heard many speakers bemoan the continuing presence of a deficit model of science communication. That's the model whereby we think as scientists that if people just knew the right science, they would agree with us and they would follow what we have to say. Imagine a scientific finding. I think that we could say it's at least 3 decades old, that has been robustly demonstrated to exist. Imagine a corollary in the life or physical or biological sciences of a finding 3 decades old that we still ignore to this day. Why? I think that it lies in the inherent attractiveness of this model. I myself am guilty of this. Every time I tell my teenage children that brushing their teeth will reduce cavities, or eating protein will give them a better start to the day, only to watch them ignore me, tell me to stop nagging them, or tell me I'm wrong because they watched a YouTube video that told them differently. Now you could say, once again, an example of irrational behavior, but there are very good reasons why they do that. One can say that human development, their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, and we know that the illusion of invulnerability is heightened among youth. We could also say that given their age, the need for psychological reactance is heightened due to the freedom threat that I'm trying to control them. That said, we still know that it's frustrating that even with that knowledge, they choose to ignore good advice. Indeed, much evidence has shown that not everyone will pay attention to information, but there are factors that predict a higher likelihood that people will seek out risk information and respond accordingly, some of which are listed on this slide. Yet, even when you have an audience that is paying attention, they are still actively filtering your information through heuristics and biases, including emotional responses. So consider the idea of the pink slime. An emotional response is disgust. That is a mechanism whereby somebody may perceive greater risk or push back on that message through that mechanism. We have positive emotions, such as hope. One of the studies that we did found that people were more likely to seek out information about cancer clinical trials when they also had hope in relation to the potential outcomes. Risk perceptions are another aspect that we've talked a lot about at this meeting, and beliefs about the topic and the source. And if we go again back to the issue of glyphosate, we can think about the source of this as Monsanto, which is an organization that people love to hate in the US. And so therefore it heightens risk perceptions related to this cause. Social and cultural factors also influence responses to information. Let me take an example. Drinking wine and pregnancy. One can say that the decision to drink wine while pregnant is arguably an individual's choice. Do I order this glass of wine and drink it or not? Yet, the difference in the rates of drinking around the globe differ vastly. And this is capture of a illustration that was published in The Lancet a couple of years ago around the frequency of drinking around the globe. And what you can see here is that the darker countries had a higher frequency, reported frequency of drinking while pregnant. Doesn't talk about the numbers, but just sort of drinking. And the lighter ones do not. What we can notice about this is that some of the countries with the lowest rates are also countries where cultural factors and religious factors are perhaps drivers, as drinking is inconsistent with religious beliefs. As it happens, Europe, which you can see down in the lower middle, it has some of the highest rates, including Italy, prompting a recent campaign to discourage this behavior. I unfortunately do not read Italian, so I must rely upon the source of this news, which stated that the campaign on this started by saying 50 to 60% of Italian women drink wine while pregnant. And here are the reasons why this is a bad thing. I hope that this campaign will be effective. My concern, however, is that research on social norms, or that idea of what those around you are doing, has suggested that people might interpret that message as saying, most people are doing it. Therefore, if I do it, there will probably not be social sanctions because others are doing it around me, and I'm probably fine to do it because I don't see the attendant consequences as common. So again, we need to be thoughtful and understand how these campaigns are developed. And again, I hope that this was developed after research with the target audience. So observation 3, there exists more ways than ever before to engage with the consumer. As social media has figured prominently during several talks during this session, I'll add in some other examples that may be more on the frontiers, and some of which my predecessor spoke to in his talk. As with any technology, though, I'll start by saying that there are both benefits and risks. And it is true that technology is outpacing our ability to monitor these risks. So, a few examples. Robots. Robots and their ability to be first responders in disaster cases are getting a lot more attention. One can say, well, how does this necessarily apply in food safety? And this is where I would ask you to imagine the scenario where robots would be sent in to a high-risk situation. We can imagine, though, robots, and the children in the previous video talked about robots delivering food. Indeed, they are doing that. They're doing it on the sidewalks of Palo Alto in California, and I believe they're doing it in London. And there, the risks, so to speak, are more in relation to the other people on the sidewalk, they say. But I think we also need to consider what are some of the other social risks or workforce-related risks. But again, one might consider robots in relation to food safety. Drones are another aspect. And speaking of food delivery, you can have your food delivered in some places by drones. And there are questions related to the quality of the packaging and the safety of the food that en route and transit. Not only with food delivery, though, we can imagine drones in relation to agricultural observances. Digital agriculture is an area that is growing hugely, and so thinking of remote sensing also related to disease surveillance. We can also think about the gamification of food, and this is a slide from a study that looked at time to eat to encourage youth 11 to 12-year-olds to eat more healthy behaviors. And children would choose a virtual pet, in this case a dinosaur, and after they would eat in the morning, they'd take a picture of what they ate, and the pet would then look happy or sad, depending upon those food choices. And this study did show that working with this virtual pet did increase the food, healthful food choices of these adolescents. But again, one might argue that this is not applicable to everyone. And what if somebody doesn't have access to healthy food choices? We can also think of food recalls as other aspects where technology is being used to help identify food safety concerns quickly. For those of you that have supermarket cards, I remember getting a text that something that I'd purchased last week from my local Wegmans was getting recalled. And I would have not known that because I am not one to visit food recall sites, but getting that text was very instrumental in knowing that I shouldn't consume that food. Another is this more along personalized health, and I just show an example of sort of a product around Nutrafone, allowing people to insert a piece of a technology into their smartphone to measure their vitamin B12 concentrations and get real-time feedback via the phone on this. And again, looking at the ideas of mobile apps and food buying guides. What I think is interesting here, and you all are obviously aware of the explosion of these technologies, and the last one I'll mention is virtual reality. And in this study, it was talking about how virtual reality can be used to expose people to issues related to food safety in factories. One can also imagine it being used in other domains to expose people to what it's like to embody an obese body, or what it's like to have other types of issues in an augmented reality situation. But there are ethics involved with these issues. And I would say that this statement that just came out, last week from the FDA commissioner, saying that we need to have a better way of addressing these new and emerging technologies, that we have to look at this and to determine the safety of these sort of advancements, if you will. So I have a couple of closing slides, and one is to, again, the idea that we need to proceed with caution, and admonition is warranted that any adoption of a new communication technology should include robust study into the societal and ethical issues, including issues of privacy, security, and health and well-being. I note here and showed a picture of a story that said, "Why are we afraid of creepy dolls and robots?" If we think back to the research on how people perceive information with heuristics and biases, and that emotional gut response that people might have, for instance, to a robot, we need to understand how that would influence their reception of any information coming from these different sources. So research is needed to understand the potential for unintended consequences. So to summarize, staying relevant in a rapidly changing world requires not only the entrepreneurial spirit to invent something new, but also the disciplinary grounding of the fundamentals of the science. For communication, this entails recognizing that the only message that you can control is your own, and you better get it right. To do so requires an understanding of the factors that shape communication and the reception of that communication, and a willingness to use this knowledge in an ethical manner, which includes avoiding unintended negative consequences. Just as another note, what I've been struck by this meeting is the interdisciplinary nature of this meeting, and that is so important as we look toward addressing the challenges of the future. These interdisciplinary teams are where the transformative knowledge is going to occur. And so, again, the incorporation of social scientists with bio, geophysical, and life sciences, but it also includes looking at the diversity of the scientific team and the team members. And so we have to consider, and something that I haven't seen addressed, is the workforce development, to ensure that we are also developing workforce that represent the audiences to which we will be communicating, who will use food, And so we need to understand the role of diversity in our workforce and our science as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Adding to the complexity, and also good to recall us on the title we are working on. And I have also a number of questions myself, so also definitions of healthy food, and I think also engagement of the consumers and citizens, very important. But first of all, I would like to give one more complete round of applause for all of our speakers, because they did a wonderful job. I got some more than 30 questions already on my iPad, so I see a lot of engagement of the people who are listening. But maybe first to start a discussion, we have some 20 minutes. Is there anybody in the audience who would like to come forward with a very pressing question, comment? It's difficult to see from here. Otherwise, we can start off by showing the questions on the screen, because we got a bit of voting on it, and I agree very much also on the votes I got here. So maybe we could start with the second I have here from Ilyas Papa-Tryphon. So many possible futures, changes, challenges, opportunities. How can we prioritize strategic action? I think this is a very important question. Who would like to take that on board? Tim.
Shall I have a go? I think there are multiple answers to that. The first is to try and avoid being locked into any particular future. So if we put all of our bets on a high-tech personalized nutrition coming from biofortified large-scale agriculture, and we invest in the technologies to support that, it becomes incredibly difficult to change if circumstances change. And we won't have the research allowing us to access different futures. So I think there is a kind of element of, let's try and be certain about the uncertainty and use that to define a research agenda where we might put a focus on particular things, but we don't just ignore everything else that might happen and keep as many options open as possible. And the second response would be that scenarios exercises are wonderful in the sense that they open your mind to thinking in new ways and challenge the business as usual assumptions that we all make in our daily life, but they are about telling stories about alternative potential futures. They are not magic, it's not rocket science, they're not predictive, but they are a very useful tool to test the assumptions that we all make. And I think we should be cognizant of, in all of our institutions, accepting that there is a range of futures, some of which we can control. With technology development, we shape ourselves and past dependencies, and some of which we're going to be knocked off course by events. And how robust are our processes and our research and our thinking about what would happen if we couldn't access long supply chains, or if something happened that we couldn't get the nutrients we wanted, or if climate change created a very big drought somewhere and we had a food price spike, or we couldn't get the food around the world, or whatever.
Okay. Somebody to add to this, or was that sufficiently answered? Okay, then, Sandra, you would like to add?
I think I would just like to support Tim's view. Indeed, there's so many possible futures, but the future is likely a combination of all these possible futures that we're looking at. So we do need to look at all these aspects and not get ourselves locked into one particular one. In our study, we looked also at indicators, and maybe looking closely at this type of indicators is something that can help us prioritizing. And we also consider the idea of identifying no regret options. Whatever happens, maybe there's something that we will never regret. It will prepare us for whatever future is coming. So maybe this would be the only two things that I would add.
Okay, fine with this. Okay, then maybe we move on. Any question in real? Then I don't see somebody waving. There was a lot of voting on a question which was related to John, and I think we can combine it with another one. Synergy between EU and national research actions is advocated in Horizon Europe. How to achieve this? Can EFSA and its partners and networks facilitate this? and I would like to link this somewhere. Now I've lost the questions here. How to ensure that newly generated knowledge is quickly integrated into risk assessment? So this would be the combined question. John, if you would like to start.
45 minutes to answer that one, yeah? I think linked to the last question, there's three elements to this. First of all, we have to frame the problems correctly. We need to convene the right people in the conversation, and then we need to identify what success looks like. So whether you're talking about strategy or communication or technology, it's basically the same challenge. Now, Steph Brunsweer's question here about the synergies between EU and national research actions is advocated. We have too often been looking at instruments and not looking at impacts. We've been looking at the what of and the how of the machinery rather than sitting down and convening ourselves around how do we frame the problems that are in scope and relevant, who needs to be in the conversation, and what does success look like. So in a very practical way, at the end of my presentation this morning, I issued an invitation which may have been relatively vague to some of you in the audience, but to those of you who are the EU and national research actors, and that includes scientists and non-scientists, the point that you were making at the end of your presentation that it's a bit like post-printing press when the clerisy tried to keep control over the sacred texts. It's a bit like that with the internet. We now have a situation where co-creation is the only way forward. If it's not heresy to say in a room full of scientists we're all co-creationists now, but you know what I mean. So my invitation is very practical. It is to invite our colleagues who are involved in the risk assessment side of food safety and the scientific communities who are part of EFSA's ecosystem. My colleagues in Santé and us are working on this already in the JRC, and that we would convene maybe a first workshop with the people who I usually deal with on a day-to-day basis, which is the research and innovation science community dealing with systemic science issues, and let them and hopefully have some way of bringing a public voice into that from the beginning and try and frame the problems together that are most appropriate to address at a level where the European system and national systems and local systems can best address them. The second step then is to see who else needs to be aligned in this, and then to see what the success factors are, limit them to a number of manageable outcomes. And then the second practical step is then we can facilitate through an action in the work program of Horizon Europe a platform to allow people to structure what could then become a strategic research and innovation agenda or a partnership or a program. But I think that's a combination of a very practical invitation. And I know that Steph and Bernard and Martha and Elke indeed and your colleagues in the JRC and Michael and Santé were all willing to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this answered on this. It's a challenge as such. So as we know, everything is a challenge, but we should take it as a positive. I have another question which is quite provocative coming from an EFSA colleague. Anne Theobald said 10 years ago, we were talking about nanotech and food. Will personalized nutrition be a similar hype for the broad public? So you know to whom it is addressed, Tim.
Thank you very much. Well, I guess the hype goes back longer than 10 years. And if those of you remember when President Clinton and Tony Blair had a joint press conference to announce the initial sequencing of the human genome, within days of that, people were talking about using the human genome to tailor personalized nutrition approaches for people. So already there was an idea that genetics might be really important. But I think those of us who are working in the area were much more cautious than many of the commentators, and we recognized that the evidence base was pretty thin. And in fact now, after almost 2 decades of linked research between genetics and nutrition, we understand much more about these interactions, and we understand that tailoring nutrition based on genotype is far from simple. And my personal view is that that's not the future of personalized nutrition. The personalized nutrition is not about some magic genetic test telling us what we should or shouldn't eat. I think the future of personalized nutrition is about understanding each of us, our personal choices, our aspirations, and helping us to choose the kinds of diets which are appropriate for us and appropriate for the planet. And I think we can use that in ways which are much more sophisticated, much more sensible than a lot of the hype.
Okay. Thank you very much. We saw already the kids speaking about this, saying, I mean, we see already their preferences, and I think it's clear if somebody, I don't like broccoli, maybe it's the body already saying, maybe this is also not so good for me, I don't know, but this is very difficult and complex. A real question? Not yet. It's very comfortable to have all of these already prepared. Is there somebody? Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yes, we talked about biotechnology, pharma food, but there was no mention to agroecology. FAO states that agroecology is the future in food production if you want to give food to a growing population in a limited planet. I wonder if this vision is shared by this panel. Thank you.
Yes, please, Tim.
Thank you. That's a great question, and it exemplifies, I think, the world of trade-offs. Agroecology has the potential to grow food in a much more environmentally sympathetic way, but it will not grow the amounts of food that we are currently relying on to make food so cheap that we can overeat it and waste it to our heart's content. So it implies that we have a quite different food system if we are going to broadly adopt agroecology. And that's just one of the things that we have not really dealt with, is the implicit choices created by trade-offs in our food system. We can do almost anything, but almost anything is a wicked choice because some people will say it is a negative. So if I just may, the first question on this sheet, is the acceptable exposure a constant, or does it trade off with circumstances, is a prime example of a trade-off. If you are in severe poverty or starving, you will eat anything that somebody who is rich would not. And if you have very deeply held beliefs about sustainability, you will often eat food that is way beyond its sell-by date because you don't want to throw it out. So all of these things are context dependent, but we tend to think of them as absolutes.
Thank you very much also for taking up that question, because it was on my mind to show it. Anybody else to add to that? Yeah, John?
What I said when I said we need to ask about what does success look like, what is the destination, and too often when the projection and prediction confusion is made, we think it has to be this technology, it has to be this policy, it has to be that regulation. You have to start with the destination and say, well, what does a healthy food system look like in 10 years' time? And the rest of us in public policy or science and research have to ask the questions, make the toolkit available, and the governance system, which I think is a really important issue beyond simply food safety governance or EU governance, has to make it possible for the democratic nature of what that future should be to be fed by an informed series of options. And it may be very different where you live. Half the cities in the world, for example, will be built in the next 15 years. So there are huge opportunities to get things right. There are mixes of things and technologies, whether it's regional or long chain and short chain or aquaponics or different forms of using the oceans for new forms of proteins or personalized diet. There are all kinds of tools there. What we actually need is a new narrative and a way to actually talk about food, which is, I think it's what I was trying to say this morning. The reason why food-related aspects become so political very quickly is it is a manageable way in which people can deal with complexity close to them. And a lot of the solutions are going to have to be place-based. A lot of the changes will have to be place-based. So what we have to do is not simply drive technologies or instruments or policies or regulation, is actually drive what would the destination look like and allow people and governance systems to step up and tell the rest of us what they need from us. So.
Okay, thank you. Is there any question from the speakers you would like to bring forward and to have discussed? See, you are all very well aware of the complexity and understand very well. I have quite an interesting, I think there's a lot of need still for research to understand things. We already heard sometimes we have not many standards. What does a healthy diet mean? What does a sustainable production. I mean, I think there is still a need for work, which is very positive for us, for this audience, I'm sure. But I would like to bring on one more question forward from Nico van Belsen, who talks again about the personalized nutrition, maybe well adopted by the health conscious. However, a large part of the general population hardly follows nutrition advice. So that will even increase inequality there. So maybe, Catherine, you would tackle this, or who would like to answer that question? Maybe, can you see the question maybe there? So, you know, personalized nutrition more for the health conscious, and the others don't follow advice. You mentioned your kids.
Right. So I think that one of the things that, as I'm looking at these different questions regarding personalized nutrition or passive audiences, is thinking about why would the consumer be engaged? Why would the individual be engaged? And so I think that your point about going out and trying to understand people's governance and what their interests are, what their values are early on can help us to understand how they might use different technologies, how it might introduce disparities in the system, how people might be more willing to incorporate it into their daily lives. And so I guess just in relation to this, it's going out and meeting with people. I think that, we do have research methods in the social sciences related to surveys, focus groups, data collection, interviews. There's also processes around deliberative forum, public meetings. There are different ways to get out and to interact with people to understand how they are using these technologies and how they may be misusing them, or to what extent they see them as having benefits. And so I would just say that applying those methods would be a way forward to try to reduce that.
Okay, yeah, Sandra, you would like to add?
Yes, I'd like to add something. I'd like to add our conceptual map, the first slide that I showed you. Personal choices and what the consumer in the end decides to put in his or her mouth are not only influenced by what he has in his mind before. There's a whole array of factors in our environment that will influence these. And I think we can also work on those ones. And these are things that will make our environments more prone to the choice of healthier food products or more sustainable food products. And they range from policies to many other aspects, and policies in many areas as well. We're not speaking only about health policies. There's a whole array of transport, social care, etc., that also impact and will influence consumers' choices.
Okay. Nobody else? Okay. And as we have, as I said in the beginning, the discussion of today, but also over the last days, this may all help to support EFSA in coming up with a good strategy for the future. There is a nice question from Francesca Riolo. I don't know whether we can project it here. It's quite a complex question, but it says, shouldn't EFSA's strategy to be based on the vision of what needs to be done to reach a desirable scenario built around food sustainability, rather than passively on what seem mostly undesirable? And so maybe this is a good question. I think this is a bit more towards the benefits, and we are talking too much maybe about the risks. But can somebody add to that? Is that a good idea, or? Yes, Tim, please.
Hello. Good, this works. I'm a bit of an idealist, and I would say yes, because if the point of our food system, as John said, is to deliver nutrition, health, and well-being to people, we should start off there and think, what would a food system that does that look like, and where are the challenges? Where are the challenges for safety? Where are the challenges for health through nutrition, and how do we integrate those two? Part of the challenge, I think, is that we have very siloed governments and we have very siloed disciplines, and actually getting them all to talk together is quite difficult. And we had a fantastic session yesterday morning, day before, on nutrition and the importance of dietary patterns for sustainability, but also for health. And how do we integrate all of that into where we want citizens to be, to have a healthy diet that increases their well-being and increases the planet's well-being. So I would really nail that to the center of EFSA's strategy about the end point and work back from the end point. And in a sense, that's what scenarios is about doing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, John, please.
I think EFSA have a sufficiently difficult task at present and need all the support and help, scientific advice and connectivity with the rest of the food system to help them to do what they're being asked to do in an exceptionally difficult environment. I think the issue is not whether EFSA should be asked to take on the burden of every aspect of food sustainability. It's how can the work that EFSA specifically does in its ecosystem be part of the response of all the different actors who are responsible for food sustainability. So I think it's more about an articulation of how food safety, in whatever way we want to define that into the future, plays a coherent role, and more of an articulation between that and all of the other actors. Because I think one of the things, and this is why we're in the situation we're in political debate, is there's a lot of blame going around and very little responsibility. And we can't keep asking other bodies and others to take on something which actually has to be part of a shared change and a fundamental shift across policy, society and the economy, which is what sustainability is at. So if you think there's an agency that can deliver food sustainability in economic, environmental and societal terms, I'd like to see it.
Okay. We have to close soon, but yes, please, sure. John. Yeah.
Additional comment, I agree with both colleagues. I think it also comes back to how we think we want to see society operating. Yeah. Because I think at the moment, we have a very permissive system for industry, which essentially uses EFSA as a policeman, which is a kind of backstop on things going wrong, and we expect somehow or other that industry will then drive the innovations that will be good for us. We see that that can deliver what we want in some cases, but not always. And I think the political question will be around the balance between national governments and European organizations trying to take some kind of control of that direction of travel rather than leaving it for others.
Okay. I would like to conclude this question and answer session by a comment made by Alistair Witherspoon. He is really saying, you guys doing the research as scientists, we have to better articulate our impact of the work, and we have to better show this. I think this is absolutely, I agree fully with this. We have to be better in communication of all of the potential risks, but also of the benefits to the public, because, and we can all talk about educated consumers, but I think it is a very, very difficult subject, and I think we scientists have to be better as well. I agree with this. So this brings me to the end of a wonderful session of this morning. I have plenty of more questions. I'm very happy to see this, very much engagement. I think there's plenty of time to discuss more in the coffee break, which will be outside in the catering area. We will come back here all, please, at 11:10 sharp, because then we will start the panel to be moderated by Robert Madeleine. So thank you very much. You have been a wonderful speakers and wonderful audience.